And hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Strive's Talking Points. Today, I'm going to cover this little story here you see on Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar says she does not recognize Venezuelan interim president, I should say Guaido, defying democratic leadership and Western governments. Now, this is on Fox News. Normally, I don't really care for Fox News much, but I'm going to use their story as my springboard. Minnesota Democrat Ilhan Omar says she does not recognize Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido as the interim Venezuelan president, defying consensus among Western leaders and her own party. Now, basically, in an election that his party boycotted, they literally didn't go out and vote, didn't allow any candidates to go in, and the candidates, I believe if you look it up, there was one candidate threatened with sanctions by the U.S. if he ran. Their party lost the election, which, if you can imagine, here in the U.S., let's say that the Democrats decided they would post no one anywhere in the U.S. for a position. You would expect a resounding defeat of that. If you boycott the election, you boycott the voting, you boycott the democratic process, in which you wouldn't receive any seats. That's kind of what happened with Juan Guaido and his opposition party. That has set off the chain of events leading up to where we are today, not really anything else. Well, the Constitution of Venezuela says there needs to be an election called within 30 days. And we're waiting for that to happen, Omar said during an interview with The Intercept. What we should be doing is having a diplomatic conversation and bringing people to the table and bringing a partner in facilitating that. Sorry, I can't speak. But we're threatening intervention, and we're sending humanitarian aid that in the guise of, eventually invading this country and the people of the country that don't want us there, she added. Now, this kind of comes from the recent state. Venezuela is lighting up, and Ilhan Omar, so far I know, is one of the only people kind of speaking out against it publicly. This follows where she had the meeting where she kind of went after the Trump envoy to Venezuela, who actually was partially responsible for the revolution, the Sandistas, murdering thousands of people because the U.S. did not like the government in that country. I don't know if you know this, but the U.S., we don't have the best track record in Latin America as far as regime change, or matter of fact, anywhere in the world. It has caused great death, great destruction, and great displacement. You don't really kind of get that. The U.S.-backed coup in Venezuela is not a solution to the dire issues they face. Trump's effort to install far-right opposition will only incite violence and further destabilize the region. We support Mexico, Uruguay, and the Vatican's effort to facilitate a peaceful dialogue. Basically, in Venezuela right now, you have the Western nations, UK, Germany, France, and the US, all calling for the end of the socialist government there and the installation of their chosen leader, Guaido, not chosen by Venezuela, but chosen by the Western leaders. In here, you see the UN has not actually officially authorized the sanctions that are currently going in against Venezuela, and you see Russia is vetoing what the U.S. is trying to do as far as start a regime change war, calling it a mere pretext for sinister intent. Russia vetoed American resolution in the UN Security Council on Thursday for new elections and unhindered distribution of humanitarian aid in Venezuela. Now, what, you may ask, aid is being blocked? That is the aid coming from the U.S., which we have used in the past to smuggle guns, weapons into these different regions for arming a revolutionary group, which you've never really heard of any violence in Venezuela up until now. The U.S. actually funds one of the political action groups in Venezuela, and the opposition party are partially funded by the U.S. They receive, I believe, $5 million in aid. And anyway, here we go, moving to the next piece. U.S. media corps supporting a U.S. overthrow of Venezuelan government has for years pointed to the country's economic crisis as a justification for regime change. Now, the country's economic crisis comes into play because their social welfare system is primarily supported by oil exports, the oil industry. That's where they derive most of their money from. The Venezuelan people happen to sit on the largest, I believe, the largest reserve of oil in the world, and it was funding their socialism, social welfare. I don't know which way you want to call it, but it was funding it fairly well for several years. However, the U.S. sanctions have essentially walled off the country. They are sitting on a few $1 billion in the U.S. Through the company Citgo, which the U.S. Should say has transferred the rights to that money to Guaido, the president that the U.S. has chosen, the leader of the opposition party, and that the UK and EU have moved all of the gold and holdings of the country of Venezuela over to the opposition president. He is now a billionaire elected by the U.S. and the EU, and takes possession of Venezuelan property. I'm sorry, I was thinking about Brazil. The Sister Eugenia, Russian president of the foundation, I can't say that word, a Venezuelan human rights NGO that was established in 1978, has special consultative status, the UN told The Independent. In contract with popular communities, we consider that one of the fundamental causes of the economic crisis in the country is the effect of unilateral coercive sanctions that are applied in the economy, especially by the government of the U.S. The human rights issues going on now are simply because of U.S. sanctions against the country. We have, in this country, decided that we do not like socialism enough that we are strangling other countries with sanctions. These sanctions are not supported by the world at large, and these are very simply just the U.S. Now, testimony made by Maduro, the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and U.S. policy responses. Now, on these types of things, you see this lady here, Marcela Escobari. She is testifying. Venezuela presents a complex situation for humanitarian response, where there is a legitimate, widely recognized, and democratically elected entity in the National Assembly and its leader, Juan Guaido, who is sworn in as the interim president. However, he does not, as of now, have command of military forces or the government bureaucracy. Now, there is a legitimate, widely recognized, and democratically elected entity in the National Assembly. Think of that as Congress. Think of its leader, Juan Guaido, Speaker of the House, which I believe is Nancy Pelosi for the U.S., has been sworn in as interim president. Now, however, what it should say here, however, in the election of 2017, the National Assembly members led by Juan Guaido boycotted the election and therefore did not receive or not re-elected. So there's been an official request of humanitarian aid from the National Assembly and a response from the multilateral community. It is a contested environment where the delivery of aid being exploited, blocked by Nicolas Maduro and the military. Now, this is actually untrue. Aid is coming into the country from other nations. It is not, however, coming in from the U.S. The U.S. joins over 50 countries. There are 116 recognized or so countries in the world. These 50 countries are essentially the U.S. group: India, China, Russia, Africa. Most of the Middle Eastern groups do recognize the election. Spain, the former prime minister, and groups at the UN. The UN actually sent someone there to observe, and all of that has come to play. This is the U.S. play to sanction and to take over the country. I would expect in the next 2 to 3 weeks we will move troops in and actually effectively invade. As of now, I believe 3 million people have been displaced by this current action the U.S. is taking. Essentially, the U.S. sanctions and the inability to borrow money has spiked the currency crisis, has really caused all the issues. And you see all this, you see all these videos coming out now about starvation. You see these pictures. There was actually this gentleman here who was in Bolivia, and I watched the video they did on it, the humanitarian crisis, the manufacturing of it. What's going on in this country is these products, because of the way inflation is working right now, because it is hyperinflation. The products are all there. They're just, the pricing is so difficult to afford. That pricing is coming that way because of the inability to move money in and out of the country, to secure loans, to do the things that countries normally do in order to function. And then, of course, you have what's causing all this: America's role in Latin American regime change. If you don't know, over the last few years, the U.S. has been focused on regime change in Middle East. We are currently fighting in Yemen and in Syria and in Iraq and in Afghanistan. However, now, as the Syrian ISIS rebels have fallen back, we're now mostly just funding the Iraqis and the Afghans and training the Saudis to fight in Yemen. We are now switching back to Latin America, and we have in Caracas, we've had a couple of things: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Panama, Nicaragua. Mexico is quite a ways back. However, I believe the Obama-era gun sales across the border, where they were able to buy and sell, American military-grade hardware, that was never as big a story as I thought it should have been. We've crushed Haiti through protecting democracy. Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Grenada, other interventions. The U.S. has essentially, anytime a government is elected which does something the U.S. doesn't like in this region, we manufacture a humanitarian crisis and crush it. Also, the Lima Group. This is a group here, Brazil. This is the group which is trying to say they're wanting to overthrow. However, they're just wanting to basically get the government back on track. However, under U.S. sanctions, that doesn't matter. But anyway, Ilhan Omar, the only congressperson I've seen who actually supports not taking Venezuela. I'd have to look up Tulsi Gabbard, but this video was mostly about this story from Fox News. Sorry I went on forever. Yeah, we're about to invade a country that is having a humanitarian crisis because we force sanctions upon them in order to create a humanitarian crisis. And yeah, Trump, Pompeo, Mike Pence, everybody, John Bolton, are all just dying to conquer another country. Thank you and have a great day. Leave your thoughts below.